the Disney Pixar movie Soul was released. How many of you saw the movie Soul? There weren't many in the first service either, and I'm just going to say 2020 was filled with so much chaos that I think, unfortunately, that movie didn't get as much viewing as it could have. But this movie, as you can see on the screen, centers around a guy named Joe, who's there on the left. And Joe is a middle school band teacher. Joe's passion in life is jazz, but he feels stuck in his career as a teacher when all that he's wanted to do was to play piano on stage with jazz greats. He wants to be a great jazz musician. On the same day that Joe's school principal offers him a full-time teaching position, which he did not have yet, he gets a phone call from a former student who plays drums for a famous jazz saxophonist. And the band is in need of a pianist that night with auditions immediately. So he gets up and auditions. He goes to the audition. He gets the gig right away to play that very night. And then he exits the club in the happiest of moods. He walks down the street as if his life has just begun, and then he walks right into a manhole and dies. It's crazy, right? But that's what the audience is led to believe, that he is now dead. And he finds himself in the form of the little figure on the left side of the screen. He is a soul that has about to enter the great beyond. And when he tries to escape, because he can't imagine his life being over, he ends up falling into a different realm known as the great before. And in that great before, he gets misunderstood as a mentor and paired with a cynical soul who has been trying for centuries to be born, but has no desire to become a human on earth. And that's the little soul in the middle of the screen there. So the two of them work out a deal that if he helps her get ready to get her passed to earth, then she'll give it to him instead so that he can just return. Now, I think many of us can relate to Joe in this movie, except for the whole dying part. We haven't experienced that yet. He's chased his dream, though, of becoming a jazz artist all of his life, much to his mother's disappointment. When he's offered this full-time job, his mother is elated because it means that he'll have some job security. He won't be jumping from gig to gig anymore, and he can finally settle down. But from Joe's perspective, life as a band teacher doesn't live up to what he's always wanted, and it makes the rest of his life seem like a failure. Have you ever felt like your life didn't live up to what you dreamed or what you imagined when you were younger? I wonder if the picture that you had when you were a child of what your life would be like at what your age is right now, it might be far different from what you're actually living right now. I know that for me, it's a world of a difference. What I thought when I was a child is very different from who I am now. Maybe the expectation when you were younger of where you would be in your life right now with your career or your relationships or your place in this world isn't matching up. And that can jade a lot of your life experiences. Life is not always what we think it should be. And that's how it is for Joe. As soon as he realizes what is happening after he dies, that he's going to this great beyond, he says, "My life has just begun. My life has just begun. I can't be dead." For him, he could not find happiness. His life truly could not begin until he achieved his goal of being a famous jazz artist. It seems like Paul would be a great influence in Joe's life, at least from what he writes to the church in Philippi. And so I'd like to read from you from his letter to the Philippians, starting in chapter 4. And if you all want to get out your Bible app on your phone to follow along, that could be a great thing to do. You're welcome to use your phones in church, I promise. But this is Philippians chapter 4, starting at verse 4. "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not worry about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Keep on doing the things that you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned for me, but had no opportunity to show it. Not that I am referring to being in need, for I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well-fed and of going hungry, of having plenty and of being in need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Well, if you know Paul and what he is going through as he writes this, you wouldn't think of him to be someone that would be an influencer for anyone. For those of you who don't know, just a little backstory on Paul. Paul was a radical Jewish man who lived most of his life persecuting Christians until he has this incredible conversion that changed his life and led him to become a missionary. He planted lots of churches all over. And we read some of his story in Acts, but we also find out a lot about him through the letters that he wrote to the first Christian churches. A lot of our New Testament is made up of those letters. And as he writes to this church in Philippi, he's coming to the end of his life, and he's literally in chains. He is on the Roman version of death row. He's waiting to be executed for preaching the gospel, and up to this point, he has endured so much. He's endured a shipwreck, angry mobs, almost being stoned to death. But it's not just Paul that's facing this persecution. All around the church is being persecuted, and people are living in fear. Their present reality, their culture, is the exact opposite of what Paul is instructing them to do here. Their present reality is a world that is constantly at war, where peace means ignoring or detaching or hiding yourself from others. So that's the image that we have of life in the church in Philippi. It's a colony of Rome struggling with what it means to be a Christian in a world where fear wins the day. And Paul comes in and he says, "Rejoice in the Lord always." Crazy, right? He is in prison, in chains. And in case they didn't get that, he just continues going, "Again, I say rejoice." Now, if you came into my office, let's just suppose something. If you came into my office to talk to me about the struggles in your life, if you're dealing with discontentment, and I just said to you, "Well, rejoice in the Lord always," you probably wouldn't come back to talk to me. And I wouldn't blame you. We don't want to hear blanket cliche statements or things that feel like empty words when we ourselves are feeling empty and stuck. But I want us to look a little deeper to see what Paul might be getting at. First, Paul isn't telling his readers to rejoice for everything that's happening in the world. That's not what he's telling people to do. Nothing is going well for Paul or for the church, but Paul isn't saying to rejoice in our relationships or rejoice in your family or in your job or in your security or in your wealth. He's not saying rejoice for the suffering that you're going through. Thank God for that. That's not what's going on here. Paul is saying to rejoice in one thing and one thing only. Rejoice in the Lord. I think we're prone as humans to put our trust in things that aren't safe and that aren't permanent. We put our trust in political leaders thinking that they're going to solve all the problems of our country when no political party will do that at all. We put our trust in our security and the things that we have that make us happy, and we also put our trust in the things that we're able to do that might also make us happy. But then when those things are taken away, it crushes us to the core, and it makes us not act like ourselves. Author Brian Erickson writes this: "When we build our joy on the sand of this world, we should not be surprised when the storm comes along and takes it away. The only one who we can completely trust, the only one that we can rejoice in, is in the Lord. It's the only sure thing. And in that rejoicing, even amid hardship, we find our peace." Now, that might be something that's really hard to do. And I really love an author named Kate Bowler, who writes a lot about gratitude and how we can be both grateful and honest in the midst of our struggles. And so I'd like to read a passage to you from her book. It's a little lengthy, but it's all good that I just couldn't use my own words, so I'm using hers. And it's in a book that's called Have a Beautiful, Terrible Day. This is what she writes: "The moment we want to make any spiritual progress, we immediately feel how difficult it is. Do you want to feel more grateful? Wonderful. Now you feel a lot of pressure to be grateful, and you wonder if you ought to be the kind of person who yells, 'I love this,' at every red light in traffic. But gratitude is part of our ability to notice. We might notice the big realities of the day. Thank you for that paycheck. Thank you that this doctor is better than the last one. Our gratitude might be incredibly minute and ultimately eclipsed by other feelings. Well, God, this addiction is so depressing, but this hour was okay. Either way, we are building our capacity to do this hard work. The better we get at gratitude, the better we can get at noticing smaller and smaller reminders of God's goodness. We might notice the softness of someone's hand we get to hold. We might notice how much a television show really makes us laugh. Gratitude is not a solution to suffering, but it sure does make the rest of existence more meaningful." In his letter, immediately after telling them to rejoice in the Lord, Paul encourages the church to not worry about anything, which is another one of those statements. If you're a worrying person, it's impossible to follow just because you're told to do it, right? So Paul quickly says in the same sentence, "But in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." So first, Paul says, in everything, rejoice. And then, again, in everything, pray. Talk to God. Let your heart be known. Lay your worries down. We can't find peace or contentment through our own achievement. We can't just psych ourselves up like we're in some cycling track class trying to just get to the end of it. That's not how this works. God is the only one who can bring peace to our soul. And I think that's at the heart of all of this. Letting go of our control is so difficult. At the core of our unrest are the thoughts that we're not measuring up, or we can't be enough, or do enough, or have enough gifts or skills to handle what's right in front of us. But when we think that we're not enough, or that we don't have enough, we're completely ignoring and forgetting grace that's right there in front of us. We forget that we are enough because Christ is enough. We can't find contentment on our own. We can't pull it off by ourselves. And that's okay, because we can call on Jesus anytime. You see, the neat thing about prayer is that it works with so many other things. You might be able to pray and instantly feel at peace, which is so wonderful and does happen. Other times, it might not feel that way. It can just be a flame that might not take away your worries instantly, but it can help you then to see Jesus in other places where he'll lead you to that peace. So sometimes Jesus shows up in church, or sometimes Jesus shows up in a therapy session or in prescribed medication. Paul talks about how that peace of God guards your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. That word guards this letter was originally written in Greek, and the Greek word for guards is actually a military word for a watchman that stands guard somewhere. So when we reach out, when we admit that we can't handle it on our own, God stands and watches over and guards our hearts. So Paul says, rejoice in everything, pray in everything, and above all else, trust. Nothing is accomplished when we worry or when we sit and stew about how our life is not what it's supposed to be. So many possibilities open up when we focus on these things that Paul talks about, to focus on what is true, honorable, just, pure, pleasing, commendable, excellent, and worthy of praise. You see, our world acts the exact opposite of those things. And so what would happen if we chose every day to trust in the good news? I think it really is a shift of our focus. Towards the end of the movie Soul, there's a crazy turn of events and a whole bunch of chaos that will really just confuse you if I try to explain it. But in the end, Joe does get a second chance at life, and he's able to make it back just in time for him to play on stage for that gig that he was hoping would lead to his fame. And he has this amazing gig and performance. But afterwards, he realizes that it's not all that it's cracked up to be. He says, I've dreamed about this day my whole life. I just thought it would be different. Doing what he loved felt great, but it didn't make his troubles go away. He was still living just like he was living before. His struggle wasn't in finding his big break. His struggle was in finding contentment in life. In another part of the movie, we meet this barber named Des, who always wanted to be a veterinarian. And he was planning to study for that after getting out of the Navy, but then his daughter got sick. And so barber school was a lot cheaper than vet school. And Joe says to him in response to that, oh, you must be living your life so unhappy, not doing what you wanted to do. But Des says he's as happy as a clam. He says, I get to meet interesting folks. I get to make them happy and make them handsome. I may not be doing blood transfusions, but I am saving lives. And that is contentment. And how interesting it is that he finds contentment through serving and giving to others. He's able to find the good in any situation. If you read further on from what we read today, you'll hear Paul inviting the Philippians to help their coworkers in the gospel through generous giving. It's really still in the same chapter, just a little further down. Paul shares how he has seen their generosity firsthand, and he asks them to provide for others, knowing that God will provide for them just as God is providing for others through them. And that all comes back to trust. Because radical generosity is only possible through trust that God will provide. And embracing generosity really does build up the body of Christ. Paul is content and yet seeking help not for himself, but for those whom he works aside. And so it's this cycle that as we give and trust God with what we have, then we, in turn, are blessed in surprising ways. Time and time again, we've seen this to be true in the church. So I've been here for almost a year and a half now with all of you. And when we've put out a call in special times of the year of a need that might be in our church, we put a goal out there, like 500 boxes of stuffing, but usually a monetary goal for things, and you reach it every time. We've been able to do so many repairs in this church in the past year that were long overdue because of your generosity. And it might not be something that makes you instantly feel good because, paying for us to do simple repairs doesn't always give you warm and fuzzy feelings. But all of that is making a world of a difference for the kids and teachers that come to school here every day and for the number of people day in and day out who use this space. But what I love so much is how I see our youth catching on to this generosity thing. A few weeks ago, I shared about how they put together flood buckets through UMCOR, through the donations that you brought in, items that you brought in for those buckets. They spent over an hour in Janie's place a few Sundays ago trying to sort through all of the stuff that was brought in to get it into the buckets in the right way. None of them complained. There was no complaining at all. I was already there to be their hype person, to say, keep going. Yeah, Amy was there, she knows. They just did it. It was amazing. They worked so well together. They were just happy to be serving, knowing that what they were putting together was going to go for people who were in far worse circumstances than they could ever imagine. And that's big for a teenager to feel that. And later today, we're going to gather together again. Edge will gather together again to go to Target to shop for kids on our angel tree. This is the highlight of their year. We have to go to Target every year and do the angel tree thing. And you all, it's all because of you. You have instilled in them that heart of generosity. And now we can learn from them in return and see the joy that they have in giving together. So we have another call that we're putting out for next week. Some of you received that call in the mail with this blue card. And the call isn't for a specific project or need in our church. It's all about how we will trust God by covenanting with God in how we spend our time, how we spend our gifts, how we spend our prayer life, how we spend our time with others, witnessing to others, and how we also spend our money next year. So many of you have a practice with these cards, and Richie and I do too. Every year, we look at our expected income for the coming year, and we take a look at what tithing that, what 10% of that would look like in giving that to the ministries of the church. And we want to make sure when we do that, depending on that income and what that tithe is, that we're giving higher than we did the year before. And the reason that we do that is because growing in our giving helps us to grow in our trust of God as well. This is what it looks like, because trusting God in what we give, we're trusting that God's going to provide for everything else. And that doesn't mean that we're going to be wealthy. That's not how it works. But it means that God's going to provide for all that we need. And God provides for all that we need every single time. Full stop. And I know that this practice looks different for everyone, and what's possible for us might not be possible for you. What's possible for you might not be possible for us. And we each do what we can when we're trusting God as we move forward. And I think God sees that and honors that and uses that in the work of transformation. Richie and I decide to give because we believe in what God is doing here at Linglestown Life. You all have transformed our lives in several ways. And next week, we're going to take time to celebrate all that God has done in this past year. So I'm not going to list off all the reasons why right now. But I wonder if you pray over this card, and as you pray, you might also consider why you give, why you serve, why you spend so much time praying for or giving to Linglestown Life, and how it's transformed your life. In all of this, I hope that we can learn together what it really means to have enough. Because only when we know what it means to have enough are we able to embrace what we have and live lives of gratitude and generosity. In the first chapter of his letter, the first chapter of the Philippians, Paul writes this. He says, "I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. It is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be put to shame in any way, but that by my speaking with all boldness, Christ will be exalted now as always in my body, whether by life or by death. For me, living is Christ, and dying is gain." Friends, we know the end of the story. The victory is already won. So that means that the worries that plague our hearts never have the final word. Because of Christ's death and resurrection, God has redeemed and continues to redeem the entire world. And we have a chance each and every day to be a part of that, to be made new, and to lay our burdens down, and to know and to trust that we are cared for and loved far more than we could ever ask or imagine. I invite you to pray with me.